9 a.m. in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and here in Hong Kong, you're watching The China Show. I'm Yvonne Man with David Ingles.
We are counting down to the open of markets in Greater China. Our top stories today: Asian shares climbing to a record as AI optimism overshadowing geopolitical worries, sparked by the U.S. arrest of Venezuela's president. Oil fluctuating while precious metals are advancing.
Nicolas Maduro now in custody in New York, but his government remains in power in Caracas there amid confusion about what President Trump means when he says the U.S. is, quote, running the country.
And China condemning the U.S. move as a violation of international law. Maduro's capture a hot topic on Chinese social media, with some calling it a template for handling tensions with Taiwan. Welcome to the show. New year, a lot of stories to get into. New record as it pertains to Asian equity markets. And for a moment, you just glance at what's happening across asset. It doesn't seem like there's anything going on the geopolitical front. We'll get to that in a moment. But as you can see, tech is trumping, no pun intended, all the risks out there. Samsung is up 4.5%. There are idiosyncratic stories across most of the tech plays. You put everything together, though, you have a TSMC that's up 3%. You have a Taiwan market opening up about 2%. We're called higher on A50 futures. There has been, of course, a very strong tech bid going into the new year. Flip the page, please, and have a look at how we're doing across the commodity markets, where initially we were down in oil. That's now reversed completely. The weakness, we're up across West Texas and Brent. Gold is still catching a bit, but silver is really where the action continues to be. Really, we flip the page on the calendar, nothing much has changed as far as that bid is concerned. FX markets, fairly nuanced here. It initially was more on the haven side of things. As you can see, dollar is now on the stronger side against most. Just a reminder of some of the other stocks we'll be tracking going into the open today. And we talked about tech, and these are some of the names we'll be tracking going into the open. Some massive moves in the U.S. session. And as you can see, this is something that we'll continue to track amongst, of course, the many other things, including what's taking place still with the Venezuela story.
Yeah, obviously the world was shocked to see, of course, this capture of Nicolas Maduro over the weekend, of course, in those airstrikes. And we just heard from President Trump here on Air Force One, just talking about it and really talking about, after the fall of Maduro, who is going to come next. They mentioned about Mexico. They mentioned about Cuba. Obviously, that's where the speculation arises. But as you say, markets really in some ways shaking it all off. And really it had to come down to what we saw in that China tech story on Friday.
It really was. Because for our viewers that might have missed this, going into the new year, DeepSeek had published a paper that effectively, if you read the tea leaves, you look at what happened last year, that was something that preempted a DeepSeek moment same time last year. So markets are moving along those same lines. But yeah, I mean, we're balancing those two big stories right now. And I think what was interesting to coming out of, I think what is still ongoing on Air Force One was, I think President Trump was asked whether or not they would consider doing it again, military action in Venezuela. And he said, on the ground, and he said, if they misbehave.
If they can't rule out a second sort of airstrike there, certainly that is one thing that he mentioned. Also, talking about, when it comes to sending troops to Mexico, right? He's had conversations with the leader there. And so certainly there's a lot of questions about this sort of unilateral strategy that the U.S. has employed and what this means and what the consequences are going to be for this part of the world. Let's get to our top story now. Venezuela remains that key focus after we heard from not just Trump, but also the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that Washington would use its oil leverage to force further change. Now, the U.S. swooped into Venezuela over the weekend, seizing President Nicolas Maduro and flying him to New York to face drug and weapons charges.
There's a quarantine right now in which sanctioned oil shipments, there's a boat, and that boat is under U.S. sanctions. We go get a court order, we will seize it. That remains in place. And that's a tremendous amount of leverage that will continue to be in place until we see changes that not just further the national interest of the United States, which is number one, but also that lead to a better future for the people of Venezuela.
And let's bring in our team. Our Latin America executive editor, Kristen Harrison, joins us from Mexico City, and also with us out of Buenos Aires is our Bloomberg Economics Latin America geoeconomics analyst, Jimena Zuniga. Kristen, let me start with you. We do have the benefit of at least being a few hours divorced from the initial news. We have more context now. Kristen, get us up to speed on some big picture context. What is the U.S. trying to do here?
That's a big question to start off with. And yes, we have more context, but maybe not everything. What Trump and Rubio have both said is that, with this arrangement, they now have the opportunity to have more of a formal relationship with Venezuela and indeed to get involved more directly in the oil industry. Of course, Chevron is already there and has been there for a long time, but Trump seems to believe that there's ways to revamp the infrastructure in Venezuela, get more oil flowing from Venezuela, and that sort of hits all sorts of goals for him, including keeping oil prices low and extending the influence of the U.S. in the region. Venezuela is probably the most hostile of the major countries in South America to U.S. interests. So if he can get them more aligned with U.S. interests, that's better for the U.S. in his view.
Hemana, maybe join in on this. Everyone's kind of wondering the motive behind why the U.S. did this, and certainly drugs is certainly one thing. Oil reserves is certainly one thing. What does this tell us about also the U.S. and trying to extend their influence in the Western Hemisphere and really countering the likes of China there too?
Thank you, Yvonne. I think that's a lot of it. We heard recently from the White House on what the national security strategy is, and that highlights very clearly that the U.S. views the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence, and it can hardly claim to be a global hegemon if it's not able to assert its leadership in its own hemisphere. And so part of what the U.S. is doing is precisely that, sending a strong signal that they are calling the shots in the region.
Jimena, David here. We're now faced with a series of scenarios, let's put it that way, from worst case for the world, best case for closer stakeholders. What currently is your base case right now? What happens from here?
I think there's a very distinct possibility that there is a solid, even if messy, transition to a democratic, stable, market-friendly, and pro-Western government in Venezuela. It's a hopeful outlook, and a lot has still to happen, and a lot could go wrong. But I think that there's a solid shot, and a lot more solid after the weekend's developments than it was before. Why? Because I think that with Maduro out, it has delivered a serious injury to the regime that until Friday had displayed a lot of cohesiveness and seemed unbreakable. Maduro, until Saturday, had assumed wrongly that the U.S. Would probably not go this far. And the fact that this happened to Maduro means that for the other leaders now in the regime, they know that it can happen to them as well. And this is, I think, what we learned from Secretary of State Marco Rubio in his remarks today, is what the U.S. is after when Trump says that they are running the country. They feel that not only because of the oil blockade, but also because of the very credible threat now that this can happen to another Chavista leader, they are more capable of exercising very clear leverage over the regime to dictate the terms of what should happen next, and to, in the hopeful scenario, dictate those terms in such a way that they pave the way for a democratic transition.
Creighton, can you tell us a bit more about the international response? We've heard from the likes of China that has strongly condemned this seizure. How are other countries reacting to this takeover, and how do even Venezuelans take it?
Yeah, you can lump it into a couple of groups internationally. You've got the countries that are very closely aligned, or sort of, at least a little bit ideologically aligned with the leftist, kind of socialist-leaning government of Venezuela. Pretty universally said that this was a bad move by the U.S., that it violates all sort of international laws. And indeed, the UN Security Council is going to be meeting on this tomorrow, so still a long way to go there. There are a bunch of allies in the Western Hemisphere, and more all the time, given some recent elections, that come out and praised this move and said that Maduro was somebody who had to go, and had committed a bunch of international human rights violations on his own. So definitely two ways to look at it, but it's been very polarized in terms of reaction. For Venezuelans themselves, within Venezuela, you are not seeing a lot of celebration. We're seeing images of celebration right now because that's all over the world, right? There's a lot of Venezuelans who left. Probably at least a fifth of the population, I think is the latest count, has left over the course of the Chavista regime of the last 20 years. So you've got a lot of people all over the world who have feelings about the current government and poured out into the streets in various places like Madrid and Miami to show their happiness that Maduro was gone.
Creighton, thank you. Creighton Harrison there, Latin America executive editor. Also, Gemma Zuniga there from Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much for your coverage here the last few hours. Certainly, we want to recap what we've been hearing on Air Force One, and President Trump has been speaking for the past couple of minutes. And, it seems like he continues to, be asked questions about where to next. Where does the U.S. have its eyes on after, of course, the fall of Maduro? He's now talking about Cuba looks ready to fall. Cuba is going down. Don't need any U.S. action there. Also talking about Greenland as well, saying that we need Greenland for national security. And the EU knows we need to have Greenland as well. Some remarks about China, too, Dave, saying that he is still planning to go to China in April to meet with President Xi. That was something that was announced, of course. But, given this situation in Venezuela, you got to wonder, how is this going to affect some of the big oil buyers like China? Of course, they, too, are a big global ally when it comes to Caracas there. So certainly there's going to be a lot of implications geopolitically here moving forward, and what this means for the U.S.-China relationship as well.
Yeah, context is key here because President Trump is speaking with press, and I imagine he is taking specific questions on those topics. And perhaps it's not as if he's just going through a list of things that are likely to fall, which I think is good context there. But it certainly does beg the conversation in terms of, is the U.S. doing a lot more, deliberately a lot more conscious efforts to really increase its sphere of influence in its neighborhood? Let's use it as a starting point. Alexander Gray is with us out of Washington. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Geostrategy Initiative. He previously served as the chief of staff of the White House National Security Council from 2019 to 2021. A pleasure to have you on the program, and good morning from the Asia Pacific, sir. Let me start very, very simple. Where to next here?
Well, I think you have to look at this as the old U.S. concept of hemispheric defense. The president laid this out in his national security strategy a couple of weeks ago. This is what was traditional U.S. foreign policy for most of our history, thinking about the hemisphere very broadly. I always say it's the Aleutian Islands to Greenland and the North Pole to the South Pole and everything in between. And those are the core interests of the United States. And I think the president is taking us to that type of mental map where he's going to be looking at what his national security strategy called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This means that if you're an extra hemispheric power like China, Russia, or Iran, and you are actively engaged in what is seen as destabilizing behavior in the hemisphere, that is going to be a key national security threat. And if you're a regime like the former Maduro regime or Cuba or Nicaragua, and you are working actively with those extra hemispheric powers, you're going to be seen as an American adversary. And I think that's the mental framework that people need to understand the president and his team are bringing to this.
And do we need to talk about whether the methods are actually legal or not? Is that a side point here in terms of what the intentions are? Because, as you know, there have been some criticisms that have come through from the international community that the U.S. has violated sovereign law here.
Well, I think on the case of Nicolas Maduro, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump in both his terms did not acknowledge that Nicolas Maduro was the legitimate leader of Venezuela. I think Nicolas Maduro, he was a narco trafficker. He was indicted under Joe Biden's presidency for narco trafficking. And he deliberately ignored the will of the Venezuelan people in free and fair elections. Maria Corina Machado is the elected leader of the people of Venezuela, not Nicolas Maduro. So I think the question of international law here is totally unrelated to what the facts on the ground.
Does it have negative consequences, though, Alexander? I wonder, because you already see the likes of social media talking about, this sort of takeover, unilateral takeover by force is just creating a template for China to invade Taiwan, for example. Obviously, that's just speculation at this point. But is there negative consequences here that any sort of big power can do something like this?
Well, I view it actually from the opposite perspective. We saw that Russia already behaved this way 4 years ago in its invasion of Ukraine. China has been acting this way for a long time in terms of talking about potentially conquering Taiwan as a policy option. I think what this does is actually help restore deterrence globally. And we talk about the U.S.-led liberal order and the international order post-World War II. Well, all of those things are predicated on not conquering territory through the use of force. What President Trump is saying here is there's an illegitimate leader in Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. acted appropriately for our security interests and to push for the rule of law. And I think it sends a powerful deterrent signal to international regimes like the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, that the United States will not tolerate trying to trample that international order.
The Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did mention as well that this U.S. intervention in Venezuela is the exact opposite of what the U.S. did with Iraq. What can we do? What lessons can we learn from some of the past failures of some of these Western interventions in the Middle East? And how can we apply that to Venezuela?
Well, I think that the key thing is nation building is not the interest of the United States. And to have the United States with some sort of coalition provisional authority dictating, factional politics in Caracas and trying to shape values and institutions in Venezuela. First, Venezuela is not Iraq and Afghanistan. It's got a very different history. It's got a very different set of institutions. The Chavista regime under Maduro and his predecessor certainly did a lot of damage, but there's a long history of vibrant democracy in Venezuela. So there's certainly no need from an Iraq or Afghanistan perspective for U.S. boots on the ground to try and build these institutions. These institutions were destroyed 25 years ago. They're still relatively in modern history, they're still there and functioning. So I think it's not a far reach for Venezuela to develop back into a very capable, well-instituted democracy. Secondly, when the president talked about how the United States was going to run Venezuela, the way I looked at it was the president was saying, we cannot be indifferent to the fate of Venezuela. Not that we want to go in and we want to have, a coalition provisional authority like Iraq in 2003, but we want to have some interest in what comes after Maduro. It would be totally out of our interests to allow another strongman who is aligned with Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran to take power in Caracas. That would make this whole exercise pointless. And I think that's what the president's thinking about.
Alexander, maybe the news gods have rained in us, because quite timely we are just getting a comment coming through from the acting Venezuelan president here, who is inviting the U.S. government to work together. That's so far what we've seen so far as the statement goes. To your point there, that this will need a multi-pronged approach to keep the region stable. Convince the naysayers out there, Alex, that this wasn't simply an oil grab.
Well, look, the oil in Venezuela, as you guys know, the oil industry was destroyed by the Chavista regime over the last 25 years. PDVSA, the state-run oil company, was one of the most competent oil entities in the hemisphere, if not the world, and it's been absolutely destroyed. It's going to take decades of Western and European, American expertise to go in there and to revive that industry so it can benefit the Venezuelan people. The United States has the greatest energy wealth in the world, in the history of the world, underneath our feet. And President Trump in his 2 terms has unleashed that energy. The United States is not going into Venezuela for oil. The United States, as a process of helping the country rebuild and move on to its a better future, I think the U.S. should bring our energy industry expertise, but that is not the strategic rationale that President Trump, I think, brought us to this point.
The president and Secretary Rubio has also talked about Cuba, Greenland. These are some of the countries that they're sending their warning shots now. I'm just wondering, in your eyes, there, Alexander, who should who is going to be following, or who should be on our radar next?
Well, I would think about it this way. I would think about, a couple weeks ago, China was openly talking about doing war games with the People's Liberation Army doing war games in the Western Hemisphere. That they were simulating combat in the Gulf of America and off the coast of Mexico. A couple of weeks ago, China released its Latin America strategy that basically says the United States doesn't have a special interest in the hemisphere. I think what we should be watching is how is the United States, under this post-Maduro situation, think about regimes like Cuba and like Nicaragua, maybe even Colombia, that are actively working with American adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran. That is, again, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that was laid out in the president's recent national security strategy, makes clear that is a priority for the United States to prevent malign influence from great power competitors like China, Russia, and Iran in the hemisphere. And you look at the regimes I just mentioned, Bogota, Caracas, or Bogota, Havana, and Managua. Those are regimes that have been actively working with our great power adversaries. I would look at what choices get made in the next couple of weeks to see where the president and his advisors might be looking.
Alexander, thank you. Alexander B. Gray there, non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council Geostrategy Initiative, joining us there. Thank you so much for your time. Now, we were just talking about China. Beijing has called for Nicolas Maduro's release. And speaking on Sunday to his Pakistani counterpart, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said no country can act as the world's policeman or claim to be an international judge. Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Min Lo, on the response that we've heard from Beijing so far, Min Min.
Yeah, so China has joined a chorus of other voices that are friendly to Venezuela, including Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, Russia, to denounce the attack. And as you said, asking for the U.S. to release President Maduro and his wife and to keep them safe. They have expressed concern over this forcible sort of extraction and deportation of two leaders of a sovereign nation to the U.S. And also called on the U.S. to stop any attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And of course, China also said they were deeply shocked because the strikes came just hours after a high-level Chinese delegation was meeting with President Maduro. We know that China has been spending decades to build up those relations, and especially in the last few months when there was, heightening pressure from the U.S., and especially after the U.S. had seized those tankers. China, of course, has a lot of stakes in Venezuela because they are not only the biggest oil buyer from Venezuela, they're also the biggest creditor as well. They have spent about tens of billions of dollars in oil-backed loans to fund infrastructure projects, energy projects. And so if the U.S. comes in and runs this country now and brings in American oil company to take over the key strategic assets, obviously China's interests would also be compromised.
One of our top read stories today, Min Min, is how this question is playing out in China, across Chinese social media.
Yeah, so over the weekend, it's been heavily discussed on Chinese social media, and there are direct comparisons being drawn between what's happening in Venezuela and what could potentially happen in Taiwan. Because you think about the messaging that this is sending. If the U.S. is saying South America is its backyard, it can do whatever it wants there, the message it's sending to President Putin and President Xi is that they can also do whatever they want in what they feel is their spheres of influence, right? And China certainly views Taiwan as a part of its sovereign territory as well. And so you can see on the screen some of the social media commentators on Weibo saying that since the U.S. doesn't take international law seriously, why should we care about this? And it's providing a blueprint for China to copy, right, to launch a surprise attack on Taiwan and to seize Lai Ching-te as well. But of course, there are some analysts who are saying that may not necessarily be the case, because you've got to think about whether the Chinese military is capable of launching such an attack, especially given, all the overhaul, the anti-corruption push that's going on. It's also a good opportunity for China to position itself as the opposite of the U.S., right? To portray itself as this upholder of the international rules-based system and an alternative to the U.S.-led world order.
Okay, Min Min, thank you so much. Min Min Lo, our China correspondent there, with how this is being discussed, and certainly this is a topic we'll get into a bit further in the shows there, whether that's the oil play or the oil angle or also the geopolitical conversation taking place on your screens at those times. We have more coming up here, of course, on the China show to get into this. Right, just going into the open today, about 5 minutes to the opening bell, first sessions of the year, when you look at these markets. So suffice to say, markets are largely ignoring the Venezuela story for now. And I think when you look at how tech is really the dominant driver across equity markets right now, perhaps with the exception of China, because that had it caught a really strong bid going into the new year.
I think I bring it back to 2 weeks ago when we were both still together and we were talking about, there was fatigue when it comes to the whole AI story in China, for example, that we needed fresh catalysts. And I think we found one on Friday.
Yeah.
When you talk about this paper that DeepSeek sent about, possibly this new model coming up. Are we going to see fresh momentum being put in the China tech sector once again? We're seeing that here already. And I think this is kind of the first trading week of the year where we are starting to see people come back to work, and they're really kind of digesting that news, that maybe there is fresh impulse there for that. At a time when people are talking, maybe it's time to rotate to some of the laggards like India, for example. I think that discussion is going to continue on for a few weeks, I think.
Yeah, maybe not just yet. Although we have Rahul Chadha coming on as well, who might have, of course, some
overweight in India.
India, some of the laggards. And I think the question I have maybe for him is really, does India need a bigger AI representation within that market for it to be also part of the broader structural issue? Because as you can see, it's still AI really that's playing out across the markets right now. TSMC, Samsung Electronics up by 4.5%, lifting their respective benchmarks to the upside, going into the open to the Hang Seng Tech, and within the Hang Seng Tech Index, it's Kuaishou and Alibaba with the early moves to the upside. There we go, outperforming still, although to a lesser extent compared to what we're seeing across other markets as well. The fix of the day coming in at the strongest level since September 30, 2024. The fix of the day coming in, well, at that point in time in 2024, that was almost a 7 handle on that. So we'll track this very closely. And as you can see, of course, in case you missed the DeepSeek story and the Yuan story, we have broken below 7.
Yeah, and I think it's the first time since then that we have seen that fix actually stronger sub 7 as well. So certainly that's one thing to watch here as well. We'll see what sectors are watching very closely. The EV sector obviously is one thing, but tech overall is doing quite well here today. Also checking the oil story, despite the reversal what we've seen already this morning on the back of that Venezuela news. The Open is next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back. You're watching the China Show. Well, there goes any hopes really of a slow new start to the year. We're looking at two major items on the agenda today for markets. One is obviously what took place in Venezuela and how that morphs and evolves further in the coming days and weeks. And number two is this AI rally that's taking place, and it seems to be trumping the former, at least for now. And it's giving us a reminder that markets, while we have turned a page on the calendar, it's still the same story. And it's still the winners, right? Yeah. The Koreas, the Taiwans that are still doing very well, Japan as well. As we track this sort of AI sort of trade here this morning, we'll see how HS Tech does here. But Friday was certainly the standout already. Yeah. So I think people are just coming back to work after, of course, a long holiday and really starting to think what a DeepSeek 2.0 is going to look like here for this year. And certainly that has given a little bit more oomph to these markets there. There you go. Your onshore markets are looking like this here as well. Apart from what we're seeing in crude, right? So that was the initial reaction that we saw for Brent and WTI on the back of the Venezuelan news. We have already seen the two already reverse and are seeing some gains here right now. So the Venezuela story seems to be something of, as Dave mentioned, a side issue right now. You're seeing CSI 300 up 0.8%, quite a strong start. We usually don't see that much momentum at the get-go here. And you are seeing it is the tech plays that are catching a bit. Look at Capricorn, we're up 1% here. But even some of these consumer names like Medea is up some 2% here this morning. Here's what Hong Kong is looking like. Of course, on the back of, we are seeing some declines in the pre-market right now on the get-go. Slightly down, we're about 1/5 of 1%. HS Tech is coming off, of course, and you are seeing Alibaba still doing well. We're seeing 1% gains, but Tencent, Baidu, Meituan, Xiaomi all are falling here this morning. The EV sector is interesting, right? We're just getting some lines here that's saying that China is to support consumers in purchasing new energy vehicles. So some signs that perhaps some of those subsidies will be extended into 2026. But we are still seeing the EV sector coming off some of the initial highs there as well. Given just what HS Tech did on Friday, maybe we are just seeing a bit more of that consolidation here today. But what we're focusing on, not just EVs, we're focusing on precious metals, right? When gold and silver are still doing quite well in the face of this sort of a global uncertainty when it comes to geopolitics. There you go. Shandong Gold Mining is up some 1% there
as well. Oil stock certainly is in focus as well, just given the sort of whipsaw we've seen in oil prices here. So it is a bit of a mixed picture. So you see Brent is now back up to $61 here. So yeah, that the geopolitical premium that was put in seems to be coming a little bit more, but certainly when it comes to the issue of supplies, that still is going to be the key question. A question mark once we talk about what this means for oil flows here, this takeover by the U.S. on Venezuela. So we're seeing PetroChina is down actually some 4%. CNOOC is also down some 3% as well.
Yeah, well, I have four numbers on the oil story, and I'm just going to quote our colleagues at Bloomberg Economics on this, right? So 2.5 million was about the output of Venezuela before the implosion in the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
We're currently at about 900,000 a day. So the difference is about 1.5 million in terms of that potential supply that could come online. And when you put all things together, it's negative 4% on oil prices is what they're penciling in. A lot, of course, has to go between now and that point in time. A lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of ifs, if you will. Joining us now to talk about the market's implications of all of this, if any, and other themes, joining us from New York is Rahul Chadha, founder and CIO of Shikhara Investment Management. Rahul, Happy New Year to you, sir. Thank you for joining us. Apart from what we're seeing in oil and gold in the equity complex, markets don't seem to be fretting too much about this for now. Are markets correct not to care?
Absolutely, David. We've seen it in the past. We saw it happen, a similar kind of a conflict in Gaza in recent times. Prior to that was what happened in Ukraine. And as long as these conflicts remain localized, I think markets are going to look beyond that. What is happening for markets is earning revisions are very strong. There was a bit of a tightness of liquidity which happened in November, December, but Fed's been fairly agile. And I think this $40 billion QE, which Fed did about a month back, I think is encouraging for markets.
Okay. In terms of the backdrop for equities then, what's the strategy now? I mean, it seems like AI still has some juice behind it here, particularly in this part of the world.
Absolutely, Wani. I think for first 6 months, probably, market is still kind of a focus on these AI enablers, the infrastructure providers. We've seen a big squeeze in terms of memory prices because of the shortage here. But I think what happens is as when these names go higher, they bake in a lot of optimism. So probably over the next 6 months, we would be looking to book some gains here. And move on to AI adopters. I think these are companies which are tech savvy, largely in the consumer internet space. They've kind of underperformed last 12 months, and there's decent value here. So I think these AI infrastructure plays for next 3 to 6 months, but at every 20-25% higher, book some gains and move to the adopters of AI, which is where the bigger market caps are going to be created.
Talk to us more about the adopters of AI. Like which markets, which themes, which sectors might those be in? Who are the future winners?
Yeah, so David, almost everywhere. So you look at consumer internet, you've got the likes of Tencent, Baba. They're going to win over there. You've got the Chinese healthcare companies which are going to use that. The innovative pharma where it's happening. I think India is going to be the dark house over there. So when you talk to Indian companies, a lot of them talk about how they're using AI in terms of improving their productivity, working on the logistics front, on the sales management, on the hyper-personalization. As these companies come and talk about it in the coming quarters, show the gains which are happening in terms of the consumer engagement matrix, etc., that's where the excitement is going to come. So I think the gains are going to be a lot more broad-based. It's going to be the category disruptors across key economies. And that's where China, India, parts of ASEAN stand out.
Is that why you mentioned the India adoption story? Is that part of the reason why you're overweight in India this year? I mean, are we likely to see what could be a re-rating of this market in 2026?
So India for us is where China was in mid of 2024. Almost everybody was dismissive. I mean, everybody was negative. Government was doing its fair bit in the second half of 24, where market participants were not taking cognizance of that. A similar thing is happening in India in 25. You've got the GST rationalization, you've got the labor reforms. I think the foreigners, most market participants are still looking at the India-US trade deals. The headline tariffs are still high at 50%. Our view is that you will find some resolution to that in the coming months, and economy is improved. So you've got earnings revisions which are turning positive from October, November onwards. As this recovery builds on itself, I think people are going to be excited about India. And look, we've got to understand that we are in a slow growth world. AI disruption is going to impact most economies. And that's where India would kind of stand out from a reasonably, I would say, decent nominal GDP growth of 8 to 10%.
Rahul, this on the India note, does India regulators or the exchange, do they need to do a lot more actively to attract and really make that market a lot more AI representative, really? Because I completely get the India structural story that's there, the earnings story is there, the demographics are there, but you don't want to be the market that gets the benefit just because it's the one that's underperformed recently.
So I think what's happened is, David, right now market's very obsessed with the AI key beneficiaries, and when market talks about beneficiaries, it's still focused on the AI, I would say, enablers, and that's where something like Taiwan's done well, that's where Korea's done well, where memory plays are. But once the market gets over that, because look, at the end of the day, as market realizes that, look, there is about 2.9 trillion of capex which is needed for these AI spends over the next 3 years. The hyperscalers can only fund half of it, then the half of it has to come from private credit market, and which is where there are going to be some questions raised because of high cost of debt, etc. As market gets more skeptical about these AI spends, realizing that some of these spends may be back-ended, and the fact that the space is overowned, I think the market is going to rotate out to other parts of economies, countries, sectors, etc., where you're seeing earnings inflecting for better. And I think that's where India would come. Yeah. And at the same time, our view is the narrative is going to move to AI adopters. People are going to be very excited. See, we saw that in the Tencent earnings in the last quarter, where they talked about how, again, use of AI has led to higher engagement, profit margins going up. So I think that's going to be the common narrative in the coming earning calls across the region.
And yet you're still keeping an overweight on Korea, within the hyperscalers and the like, Rahul. It's interesting, right? We saw, 70% gains last year for this market. It was certainly the best market in the region. How should I look at Korea this year, and what's really going to drive the next upside?
Yeah, so when we started the year, we were around 15-16% for Korea. And as we saw the kind of not the worst or reasonable outcomes on the trade negotiations and the trade war in April, May, we increased our exposure to Korea. So our Korea exposure was anywhere between 20 to 25%. Obviously, you had the AI infrastructure plays, the Samsung Hynix, which benefited. But I think the bigger story in Korea is this whole reindustrialization which is happening across the world. So Korea is the biggest beneficiary of this revival of industrial cycle, whether it's the US, Europe, the increasing defense spends, which are going to happen because of what we saw over the weekend, and which is where we like the market. So again, Korea, despite the re-rating it's had in 2025, it's still trading at 10 times earnings, which is 20 years average valuation. So continue to like the market. Governance is improving at the margin, payout ratios are improving. And I think we've just seen the beginning of industrial cycles. So for us, the world is like 1950s. You will have a lot of noise coming at you. You'll almost miss a heartbeat here and there. But look, this is a positive race. This is the race to the moon, which happened in the 1950s. And something which we talked in the previous decade of secular stagnation, that's going to be behind us, because a lot of these countries, India, Europe, US regions, etc., are going to be focused on region, nation building, whereas China is going to cut back on the investment spends and focus on consumption. And I think that's something underappreciated from China. If you look at the recent sound bites which are coming from governments, those are towards kind of an increasing consumption, which is a healthy rebalancing for the economy.
Rahul, Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us there and kicking off the new year with us. Rahul Chadha there, founder and CIO of Shikhara Investment. And more, of course, on our top story now. And President Trump says the U.S. will need total access to Venezuelan oil to rebuild the country. He was speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One a little bit earlier on.
We need total access. We need access to the oil and to other things in their country that allow us to rebuild their country.
Now, this comes as OPEC Plus is sticking with plans to pause crude supply increases in the first quarter. Let's get to our oil trading reporter, Rongwei Nyo, joins us now from Singapore. Rongwei, it's great to have you. I mean, it's interesting the reaction that we've seen in oil prices. Initially, it dipped lower, and then now we basically reversed all the losses here right now. How do you think traders are right now interpreting the news when it comes to Venezuela?
Right, the swing in prices that we've seen this morning is the best indication of how the market actually feels about this latest escalation. It teeters between supply risks as well as this potential outlook for even more surplus coming onto the market. So a few key facts I'll have to lay out is that Venezuela is home to the largest below ground oil reserves. Even though it is an OPEC producer, right now it's currently producing less than 1% of the world's output, making it not a very strong contender in terms of producers that the traders are watching in the global oil markets. And its key customers, of course, are US and China. So the swing in prices in the morning is pretty much a testament of how traders are trying to digest this piece of news. There are concerns of supply risk, especially to countries like China, although a huge barrage of oil on tankers floating outside of Asian waters could be seen as a near-term, sort of like a cushion against any sort of near-term supply risks. And this is expected to maybe last for the next 1 to 2 months. At the same time, with the US looking to go all in into Venezuelan oil industry, some traders are a bit more optimistic, which explains the changes in prices today.
Yeah, and we're treating this almost like a light switch. That for Venezuela to go from just under 1 million to back to let's say call it 2.5 million. That's a lot of time, money, and resources that needs to happen. What are the risks out there that doesn't become the base scenario moving forward?
All right. So by pouring investments into Venezuelan's oil industry, it is a huge undertaking because it will probably take many years. And of course, as President Trump said earlier, a lot of investments to kind of offset the lack of progress that the Venezuelan oil industry has been facing in the past couple of years. Ever since initially when the US sanctioned Venezuela and meted out tariffs, which kind of constrained its economic growth, especially in the oil sector. A lot of people are optimistic because Venezuela is one of the few places with a huge oil reserves. But we do have to note that a lot of the oil coming out from Venezuela, it's your heavier, sludgier types, which means that its use cases are a bit more limited. One reason why China is such a huge customer of Venezuelan crude right now is because it's cheap. It is a sanctioned grade that is avoided by most buyers in the world, and it is commonly used to produce, it has a specific use case in China, which is to produce bitumen. So that's kind of like an established trade flows, but a lot of market watchers are concerned that once investments pour in, there is more US presence in Venezuela. Perhaps sanctions will be lifted, and Venezuela will be seen as a legitimate producer. And then again, Venezuela will be seen differently in the global dynamics, where one of its prized, I would say, advantage for its heavier, sludgier crude right now is that it's heavily discounted to buyers like China, which are willing to forego international sanctions.
Rongwei, thank you so much, our oil trading reporter. In fact, just ahead here, we'll go into the oil conversation even further in the next hour with Mukesh Sahdev. Of course, we expect muted price action in the sector, which is exactly what we're getting as I speak. Plenty more ahead. This is The China Show. Right, commodity markets, we talked about oil. Just a quick mention that it's still in the precious metal space where arguably the same forces from last year, and then you add to that the events in Venezuela over the weekend, adding further fuel to the precious metals fire. We're up 6% as far as silver goes. On base metals, the story currently is when you look at aluminum, for example, we have top 3,000 for the very first time since 2022. That seems to be a supply story. Separately, we'll get into all of that a bit later on. But yes, geopolitics still very much in focus, but a different sort.
Yeah, apart from the Venezuela story, which is somewhat, of course, we got to extend the conversation to, is what we're seeing between South Korea and China, right? Yeah. So South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has arrived in Beijing for his first trip to China since taking office, and he is set to meet President Xi on Monday in a bid to steady ties with a key economic partner. Also on the agenda are trade and security issues, including North Korea's latest ballistic missile launch and tensions over Taiwan.
Yeah, Bloomberg Economics thinks that the markets will be watching how Beijing and Seoul manage these flashpoints that inflate the won's geopolitical risk premium without provoking the United States. For more on this, our senior geoeconomics analyst, Adam Farrar, joins us out of Washington. It's a fine balance, as most things are, Adam, but just help us understand the nuance here.
So great to be on and good to be able to bring some attention to this story on a day where I think a lot of folks are focused elsewhere in Latin America. The reality here is that Lee Jae-myung is now facing his second biggest test since he took office last summer. The first being trying to deal with the trade issues with the United States and reach a trade agreement, which he was able to do. And now it's really looking at how to address the growing trade deficit with China, and moreover, the broader relationship with Beijing as he tries to marry and balance that issue between him, the Chinese, and Washington. As you brought up, I think what we expect him to do is really push the economic agenda. He's bringing over 200 business leaders with him, including the head of the biggest Korean conglomerates, including LG, Samsung Electronics, and SK. He's trying to push Beijing to open up and broaden access for Korean firms back into the tech sector in China and try and address this growing trade imbalance that has emerged since 2023 as China's sought to increase its self-sufficiency, reducing imports of Korean intermediate goods like semiconductors. And at the same time, Korean firms are also importing more and more Chinese key materials for things like batteries. All of that is in the context of all of this geopolitical tension we're seeing, not only in between South Korea and North Korea, but really looking at Taiwan, the West Sea or the Yellow Sea, as China refers to it, in between China and South Korea, and of course, broader issues about the United States. So it's a really tough balancing act for Lee Jae-myung today. Yeah,
what's a realistic sort of outcome then that could be, in some ways, a win for Korea? Given the fact that it is a U.S. ally, I'm sure Washington is watching this meeting very closely, too.
So we certainly expect Washington to be looking at what comes out of these engagements, particularly in terms of how Korea plans to engage on the most key advanced technologies like semiconductor trade and other issues that have come under extreme pressure from the United States in the past, and even during this administration in relation to export controls and limiting China's ability to grow its own tech advantage. I think there's real questions as to what she would really be willing to put on the table. I think there's no doubt we'll see some reference to a more secure supply of critical minerals and rare earths, which are as essential to Korea as they are many other countries around the world in terms of their tech production. But also there's some positive signs that we may see Beijing start to open up the market of China to Korean cultural products, something that has been basically all but banned since 2017 and has the potential to be worth billions of dollars to the Korean entertainment and tourism industry. But it is unclear right now as to what really would constitute a win for Lee Jae-myung.
Yeah, and I think they also talked about the fact that this sort of informal ban that China has on K-pop, as you mentioned, is still might take some time to be lifted as well. When it comes to the security issues, obviously, Lee Jae-myung is looking maybe for China to try to ease some of the regional tensions, particularly when it comes to North Korea. How does the situation in Venezuela impact that in any way? I mean, does it in any way, limit the impact, or at least increase the risk of the nuclear efforts from Pyongyang in some ways?
I think right now we're not going to see any direct implications of the U.S. actions in Venezuela on the North Korea-South Korea situation and moreover, China's relationship with either of them. There's no doubt that it will suck up a lot of air in the room, and there's a real possibility that, we see Xi and Lee Jae-myung comment on it. But overall, the issue in North Korea is just completely separate, and the denuclearization question will remain front of mind for Lee Jae-myung. So we're hoping that we expect him to continue to push that issue.
All right. Adam, thank you. Adam Farrar there, our senior geoeconomics analyst from Bloomberg Economics, is joining us here right now. We got plenty more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
A new year, a new record. Asian stocks at a record. Emerging markets in the last few minutes have surpassed the recent top and are now also trading at a fresh high. More on the market rally coming your way in the next hour of the China Show.
Welcome back to the China Show. Here's a look at the HSI a half hour into the session. Yeah, we thought we were going to start off the day talking a lot about Venezuela, but I think markets right now, you could safe to say, they're taking it in stride here right now. Even oil traders are basically reversing the initial losses when it came to on that news. And we really are seeing new year, but maybe the same playbook when it comes to AI.
Yeah, in fact, this next board, when you look at the big tech plays across the region, and hence why you probably saw some of the red headlines that crossed EM benchmark, record high, Asia Pacific, record high. And, you know, this is really telling us, hey, you know what, there's a market rally that we need to be talking about apart from obviously what's happening in Venezuela. In fact, the benchmarks along this note are also getting some lift there. Taiwan, you have the Nikkei, Kospi, and we mentioned Asia Pacific has also surpassed its recent high. We're now trading at record highs there on the MSCI Asia Pacific. Now, how the Venezuela story is playing out still in some ways when you look at oil, gold, and specifically, this is something we got to get used to, defense stocks, right? As we try and ascertain two different spheres of influence and how it affects government spending and policy and geopolitics and risk premium, it's perhaps these group of stocks that will perhaps gain the most ground.
Yeah, that certainly is where the knee-jerk reaction is here right now. You take a look at what it means for the metals, as you talked about, right? Of course, gold, silver certainly is still the standout here. We did see that catching a bid here this morning. There you go. Spot gold's up about 1.5% here. Oil markets have basically reversed some of the initial losses here. We're seeing Brent now up about, 0.1% here, but really we're hovering around $60 to $61 here. But you have the likes of Goldman saying that Venezuela oil output may rise in the long term. When you talk about them owning about a fifth of the global oil reserves, but only producing 1% of output, yes, you do see that latent capacity out there. But as we've been talking about, it takes a lot to really get to that point. But yes, they have left that 2026 oil price forecast unchanged at the moment. Bitcoin is also doing quite well. We're up 2%. Aluminum as well here this morning. Let's talk a bit more about what it means for Asia equities and bring in a reporter, Winnie Xu. She's with us here. It seems like, new year, same us, same tech rally, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. Really extending that tech rally through into this year, right? Because we talked about these geopolitical risks, but it seems like markets are pretty much brushing that off. And as long as there's not much disruption when it comes to the supply chain, it's not really affecting market sentiment too much. And you're seeing that the focus now is back on tech. In fact, you're looking at the record rally. You talked about MSCI Asia overall, but we saw that Samsung really pushing further higher today on those earning expectation, and also the CES Las Vegas conference that is really gaining a lot of attention right now. And also the CEO last week said that Samsung is back and talking about how these HBM4 chips are gaining so much customer support. So lots of these individual factors helping these stocks, and overall Kospi index also reaching record high. And on the other hand, in Taiwan, you've got TSMC getting a target price boost of 35% by Goldman Sachs. They are saying that the AI is going to be that multi-year growth engine for the stock. So still a lot of attention there.
Yeah, the Samsung story, that's interesting because I think a lot of people missed that. Well, most people were off last week, right? The Samsung saying they're probably back. So how does it dovetail into, obviously AI is still a big theme, And the Korea and the 5,000 target there. What do we know about that?
Yeah, exactly. Those are really the key themes that we're watching for this year specifically. When it comes to the AI theme, it's interesting because for Asia AI specifically, on one hand, you've got investors saying that if you want tech exposure, Asia is a very cheap way to play it. But on the other hand, you've got like these concentration risks increasing for Asia chip stocks. So if there is a pullback when it comes to U.S. tech names, stocks in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea are most likely to get it affected. But on the other hand, you've also got that optimism when it comes to the China AI play because of the self-sufficiency theme, right? Because you saw all these China IPOs with these chip makers really boosting the optimism around this area. So a bit of a kind of an interesting area that we're watching. But when it comes to the Kospi 5,000 target, we're talking about record highs extending after up 76% or so last year already. And now I think it's around 4,400. So just about 10+% away from hitting that high. Yes, that's the AI optimism, but also we're watching how the government continues to push for corporate governance.
Yeah, that 5,000 target seemed to be kind of a long shot, and now it seems like we're just 10% away. As you say, Winnie, what can sway markets at this point, right? If this Venezuela story is not really going to do anything, what could derail it?
Yeah, so we're hearing that attention now is really still shifting away from the geopolitical risks, but back to AI, back to earnings, back to central bank path. And when it comes to central banks, that's also a key area that would really affect markets. And obviously, we have the Fed as the overarching theme, and now we're expecting about two cuts going forward for this year. So that's going to open up rooms for Asia, some of the Asia central banks to cut rates, especially for names like especially for countries like Thailand, Malaysia, but also India likely to still keep that low interest rate environment. So that's going to be good for stocks. But on the other hand, you've got like these other countries, for example, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, more on the rate hike path. Yeah. So that might actually be more about targeting inflation, and that might curb some of the upside when it comes to stocks.
Winnie, thank you so much. Winnie Xu there, our Asia equities reporter. As we were just talking about, Winnie just mentioned it too, right? It's going to be one of those weeks, rare instances where what happens in Vegas is not going to stay.
Doesn't stay there.
It's not going to stay in Vegas. Tech will be very much in focus. We're live, of course, out of CES in Las Vegas. Catch our special coverage this week, of course, of Bloomberg Tech Asia at the Times on your screens. We have a lot in store, of course. We're not going to give away the secrets, of course, there. Plenty more ahead. This is The China Show. Welcome back. You're watching The China Show. Let's get you guys an update of our top story, of course, which is Venezuela. And the acting president says that she does invite the U.S. to work with her country that's after an American operation to capture the president, Nicolas Maduro. And that the U.S. swooped into Caracas over the weekend, seizing Maduro and then flying him to New York to face drugs and weapons charges. President Trump earlier said that the U.S. plans to run the country with elections due eventually.
Well, we're going to run everything. We're going to run it, fix it. We'll have elections at the right time. But the main thing you have to fix, it's a broken country.
Let's get to our State Department of Foreign Policy reporter, Eric Martin. He is in Mexico City for us and has been working all weekend on this story. Eric, thank you so much for hanging out with us here and getting very late into the night for you. Tell us, just bring us up to speed. We had that conversation that reporters had on Air Force One about what the plans are for Venezuela, where else the U.S. is also looking at when it comes to the Americas as well, given this whole sphere of influence. Bring us up to speed. What's the latest?
Sure. So what we have seen has been just a remarkable, I would say, historic 48-hour period. Of course, this time on Friday night, we still had not yet seen this raid of the compound of the military base where Maduro was hiding, obviously was living and trying to stay away from U.S. and avoid capture. It's been a whirlwind 48 hours. What we've seen most recently has been President Trump talking about some of the pressure that the U.S. can bring to bear on the new acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, should she not cooperate with the Trump administration objectives. But we've also seen in the last few minutes a statement from Rodriguez saying that she's willing to cooperate now with the U.S. on a shared development agenda. This is 180 from what she had said yesterday, immediately after President Trump's press conference, where she was demanding the return of Nicolas Maduro. Maduro is set to make his first appearance in a New York court tomorrow. Just really a extraordinary weekend in terms of news and developments. And so we're looking at the very early stages. This is really just the beginning of the U.S. involvement in Venezuela, using oil as a pressure point to influence the decisions of Delcy Rodriguez, the new acting president, and trying to achieve the U.S. objectives and agenda through that leverage, through the tanker seizures and the blockade and quarantine of Venezuelan oil that we've seen over the past month.
Eric, let me build on that, because to your point, they have used oil as a very strong point of leverage, but oil's also been an objective here. Just help us understand then what the end objectives are as far as U.S. oil. This oil grab, is that an accurate way to call it?
Well, President Trump has said repeatedly that Venezuela, in its expropriations of foreign energy company assets, stole assets from U.S. companies. And of course, we know that foreign policy in this 21st century is going to be driven globally in great power competition, driven by access to energy, oil, resources. And so what we're looking at is President Trump touting the ability of American and Western oil companies to come in and spend, in his words, billions of dollars. He talked just this afternoon in Florida about oil companies, in his words, being ready to come in and spend billions, invest billions to produce. Of course, Venezuela is the country in the world with the world's greatest proven oil reserves. And the perspective of the Trump administration, as outlined in last month's national security strategy, is that they want to protect the Western Hemisphere from influence of foreign powers. That means China, Russia, others, Iran. And that by achieving this leadership change in Venezuela to give the U.S. preeminence over those oil reserves, over resources in the hemisphere, and to be able to better exploit those, both to the benefit of American consumers by lowering the price of oil, and to American companies who can be producing with those assets going forward.
Eric, thank you so much. Get some rest if you can. Eric Martin there in Mexico City for us. On the oil story, let's bring in Mukesh Sahdev, founder, CEO, and chief oil analyst at energy markets consultancy, XANALYSTS. Good morning from Hong Kong, sir. Thank you for joining us. The initial market reaction was slightly to the downside. That's quickly reversed. Let's call it flat at the moment. Does the market reaction make sense to you?
Good morning from Sydney. Thanks, Eric. Yes, the market reactions make perfect sense to me. And that's what we've been calling for. And the simple reason is Venezuela's oil was going to only one buyer, China. And from the middle of 2024 to December, China has already bought almost 300 million barrels of oil. That's the amount of oil, if US puts in the SPR, it will get to fill from its current level, SPR level of 400. So if there were many buyers and they don't get the Venezuelan oil and they have to go for alternate oil, then the oil prices react. Only one buyer who has already bought a lot, this was expected, this was priced in.
What do you think the U.S. meant by running Venezuela? I mean, in terms of oil supplies, I mean, essentially, are they going to decide who pumps the oil, for example? I mean, in terms of, really getting production back, I mean, how difficult would it actually look?
You asked a very good question, and I think the answer is probably less in the politics of it, but more in the chemistry of oil. And my answer is that, one, there is a lot of hype around, I saw the previous person, greatest oil reserves at 300 billion barrels. That is wrong. Those are paper barrels. In somewhere 2008 or so, when the oil prices touched $150 near dollars per barrel, the Venezuelan then president just increased the numbers because a lot of the heavy oil this oil is twice as heavy as the normal Middle Eastern barrels. So at that very high price, they proved that we have a lot more oil. At the current prices, these are paper reserves, and probably the reserves are probably less than or near 100 million barrels. So that's one point. And the second point is that this oil is so heavy to produce, and the number of refineries in the US and elsewhere is declining who wants this kind of an oil. We already know Saudi Arabia in the recent times canceled a 1 million barrels per day heavy crude oil project, Safania. So this is not the oil what the world needs in future as we go where we need less gasoline, less diesel. So I guess a lot of hot talk, a lot of, I guess, wrong analysis happening, and that's I wanted to just call out.
Okay, well, that's why we got you on, to help us understand the nuance. It's almost like me saying I should have been the Olympic gold medal sprinter if only I trained every day of my life since I was born. But help me understand this then. So in the meantime, though, the Venezuelans have stepped back as far as supply is concerned, and really the group that's filled that gap are some of the heavy oil producers out of Canada. Do I look at that group as potentially, if all goes to plan, as perhaps the potential losers here, the Canadians?
Good question again, David. I think you gave a very good analogy. I think that you did a better job than me. Now, in terms of Canada, there are no tariffs, and since these hot discussions have taken place between Canada and US, Canada has only lost about 500,000 barrels of oil, and that barrel of oil has gone to China. There is probably a limit to what China will buy more, because China has already bought a huge amount of Iranian heavy barrels. China has already bought huge amount of Venezuelan barrels. So China is kind of the vacuum cleaner of the oil markets for quite some time, and an oil bank for these sanctioned countries. So there won't be a very significant appetite for Canada. So I would say in short term, Canada is probably not a winner, but what Canada is probably doing is the right thing, creating some optionality so that they just don't depend on the US. But overall, I believe the heavy oil producers are not going to be winners. The winners will be in the Middle Eastern medium sour barrels.
I see. You mentioned about China. I mean, so do you see any sort of impact, this takeover by the U.S., on big oil buyers like China then?
No impact is my answer. And my answer is simple. Everybody in China prepared very well for this scenario. From the middle of 2024, as I mentioned, China was buying around 100 KBD, 1,000 barrels per day. China jacked it up. Now the January arrivals are at 900, and there is huge amount of floating oil, Venezuelan oil, also around China. So I would say China is well stocked up on these kind of heavy barrels. Yeah. So no impact on China is my answer.
Final question for you then. How does this, since it seems the conversations keep going back to the Middle East, might this affect how the other big oil producers decide how they turn on or turn off supply?
So I think the amount of barrels we are talking about, which Venezuela was exporting to China, is about 900. In my view, the entire this situation is only a U.S.-China conflict, is nothing to do with possibly the reserves in Venezuela. And then you rightly point out, then the OPEC. So if we lose some of these barrels in the market, then OPEC does have some opportunity. And OPEC has opportunity simply because of the right quality of the barrels they hold. Even the U.S. shale, which is a lighter barrel and getting lighter, is also not the right quality. So I would say more than the volumes for the OPEC player, the quality is on their side. And that's where they will continue to calibrate. And one more point, very important point, which often gets missed, is that Middle Eastern OPEC players are not just crude producers. They are built big refineries. They are big product producers. They pump a lot of oil products to the market. So when they cut crude oil, they pump products. When they want to bring the crude, they cut the products. Perfect system of calibration. And that is one big reason why we don't see oil prices go very volatile in these geopolitical times, because OPEC runs with two pedals of crude and product, and it does a good job at it.
Mukesh, real quickly, You wrote a report recently about China's oil market influence, and you call it market chess. That 2025, China changed oil markets in a very significant way. Can you explain a little bit more about it? And what does that mean for 2026 for China?
So let me give you a 2026 view first, and then I'll go and explain the 25. The 2026 picture is that China has probably planned a lot better in terms of stocking the barrels. China is also doing a significant shift in their refinery portfolio. China used to make almost 38% diesel yield, but China has reduced that diesel yield to about 27%. China is converting a lot of the diesel into naphtha. And why so? Because China used to buy a lot of the petrochemical feedstocks from the US, and with the tariffs, that got affected. So China is updating, re-optimizing its entire refining portfolio in, I would say, a way which people are not fully accounting for. And that is giving China the strength. And that's what China did in the recent the years. So 2026 means China is changing the technology. China is optimizing the refinery footprint portfolio. And China, I would say, is also focusing a lot more on the joint ventures with the Middle Eastern players, so they have the security of supply. So I would say China, in my view, is very strong, very well prepared, ahead of everybody probably in the world in terms of managing the oil markets. And they are the reasons why the oil price is neither tanks, neither probably goes very high. So China is some ways giving some stability to the oil markets. And that will continue.
Great to have you. Thanks for the time and the insights there. Mukesh Sahdev there, founder, CEO, and chief oil analyst at XANALYSTS there. Meanwhile, President Trump says he has big plans for Venezuela's oil industry and its vast reserves. Bloomberg Originals has been taking a look at Trump's possible goals for the country's oil resources.
The U.S. has carried out a series of airstrikes in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
President Donald Trump has said his threats against Venezuela, the U.S. military buildup in the region, and the destruction of civilian boats are about alleged drug trafficking. But there's another issue Trump has been talking about.
The oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Venezuela, on paper, has more than 300 billion barrels of oil,
or roughly 17% of the world's known oil reserves.
Most of those reserves are in this vast deposit known as the Orinoco Oil Belt.
But there's even more potential underground.
The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that Venezuela has more than 1 trillion barrels of oil in place in the Orinoco Belt. To put it in perspective, the world, until today, has consumed about 1.5 trillion.
The chances are they are going to outlast the world's demand for oil, so effectively they are limitless at this point.
And there already is a U.S. oil company that's been operating in the country for decades.
Chevron produces about 25% of Venezuela's oil today, is the largest investor in the oil industry and in the country.
We are going to run the country until such time as a proper transition can take place.
And you can watch more of the Bloomberg Originals reports on the terminal and also on Bloomberg.com. Right, just ahead here on the China Show, former PLA Senior Colonel Zhou will be joining us to help us understand motives and how this is perhaps being viewed in Beijing. This is the China Show.
Checking movers here this morning. Yes, we talked about oil, but really it's about the metal space, right? When you talk about aluminum reaching 2022 highs, you're seeing that in some of these aluminum stocks here as well. Chalco's up close to 5%. We talk about gold, silver, copper are still holding or at near records here right now. So certainly that's going to be the key sort of question there. Can these gains sort of sustain for the rest of the year? Chip stocks also in focus, just given this whole AI trade has gotten a little bit more of a revival here today. You are seeing the likes of SMIC up some 5% onshore. So certainly AI catching a bid here, massive bid this morning. This is Bloomberg.
The United States has an unparalleled military capability to conduct military operations anywhere around the world of the most sensitive type. That said, we are beyond that military phase right now, and now we're going to get perhaps to the less dangerous part, but certainly not the less difficult part, which is we apparently have declared sovereignty over the state of Venezuela. And now, as we have seen in American adventures in the past, we will be going into the nation rebuilding phase, which is far, far more difficult.
What I think is meant here is that the U.S. will continue to exercise influence over the decisions that are made in Venezuela, but that there won't be some kind of provisional government between the United States and Venezuela. And if the United States doesn't see the kinds of decisions out of Caracas that it wants to see, it will not hesitate to take action, much like the one that it took against Nicolas Maduro. So that plus the quarantine is, I think, what the administration believes gives them the leverage to try to move things in a pro-U.S. direction.
What President Trump is saying here is there's an illegitimate leader in Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. acted appropriately for our security interests and to push for the rule of law. And I think it sends a powerful deterrent signal to international regimes like the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, the Iranians, that the United States will not tolerate trying to trample that international order.
Some of our guests there this morning reacting to the U.S. capture of Nicolas Maduro. And since that point in time, Venezuela's allies and others, in fact, around the world have condemned the attack, the U.S. attack and arrest of the president and his wife. Beijing says it is deeply shocked by the use of force against a sovereign state. Min Lo, our China correspondent, is here to help us understand more the Chinese reaction.
Yeah, we know that China always holds very dearly to this principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of a foreign country. And this strike from the U.S. really goes against that principle, right? And so China has expressed its opposition to that. It's called for the U.S. to keep Maduro and his wife safe and to release them, also asking the U.S. to halt any attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And of course, they are shocked because just a few hours before those strikes, there was a Chinese delegation meeting with President Maduro, and they have been building up and cultivating those ties for decades, right? And China has a lot of investments in Venezuela. It's the biggest creditor, pumping in about $60 billion in oil-backed loans to fund infrastructure investment and development projects. And of course, it is one of the biggest buyer there. And we know that President Trump has said, yes, he will keep the oil flowing to China, but then that leaves China in a position where they have to depend on what the U.S. does, and it sort of upsets the balance of China's energy security, even if Venezuela still represents quite a small sliver, perhaps about just mid-single digit in terms of the proportion of China's total oil imports.
And in terms of social media, I think this Venezuela story quickly became something that was trending on Weibo as well, and many were quick to put parallels or at least maybe implications for Taiwan too.
Yeah, because it really sends the message that the U.S. is able to do whatever it wants in South America, what it views as its backyard. Then what does that mean for Beijing, right? Does it give China then the permission to also take a more assertive stance on Taiwan, which China views as its own territory? And so many people are discussing that on social media. You can see this quote that we can put up for you. One person saying, I suggest using the same method to reclaim Taiwan in the future. There's a lot of discussion here, but some analysts are saying that at the same time, Chinese military may not be so capable as to carry out an attack on Taiwan and to extract Lai Ching-te alive. Some analysts are saying that an assassination attempt might be something that is more feasible for them. But there are many different options for China now. We know they have been doing all these live fire drills. They have been putting diplomatic pressure to isolate Taiwan. And this may not necessarily change their calculus very much, given that they have other options and they do have a long timeline for this as well.
Min, thank you. Our China correspondent Min Lo there. Let's bring in Zhou Bo, CISS Tsinghua University senior fellow. He's also a former senior colonel in the Chinese army. Zhou Bo, thank you so much for the time. It seems like the U.S. strategy is that the Americas is within the West's spheres of influence, in which the U.S. is asserting its right to closely monitor developments in the continent there and try to counter at least outside, quote unquote, powers there from getting involved. What does China think of this approach, and do you believe in it?
Well, I think apparently you're right, because the United States is trying to consolidate its sphere influence in the Western Hemisphere. Sphere influence is a dirty word, but some countries do believe in it. But I think as far as China is concerned, of course, China would say this is a violation of another country's sovereignty, as all other countries would do. It is noticeable that this time, even America's European allies are reluctant to support the United States, because this is really a violation of sovereignty, a core concept enshrined in the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. So China's attitude is no different, although China's voice is louder. I think what matters is that, what kind of cost or long-term cost would the United States pay for this kind of, behaviors? Because a powerful country normally is generous, and is kind to other nations. But for the strongest nation on earth to behave like this, I think this is not a show of strength. This is an obvious show of America's decline.
Zhou, then just to maybe follow on that, certainly there are questions around the method at which the U.S. approached this, and I think it's certainly not the first time we've seen it. I mean, you look back at recent history. What seems to be clear, though, in terms of the intention, let's talk about the intention, because perhaps that's where we might get a little bit more response, not just from China, is that it seems like Donald Trump specifically and his White House seem to be more assertive in trying to sway their backyard into aligning with them. How do you think China might respond, if at all, to this perhaps more refreshed assertiveness in that part of the world?
Well, I don't believe there is a direct conflict of interest, between China and the United States in the Western Hemisphere, because basically China's involvement is economic in nature. For example, nowadays in Beijing, we're having, loads of cherries coming from Chile. And who can now oppose to China buying cherries from Chile, right? So we're not doing anything massive in terms of military involvement in Western Hemisphere. So I don't believe it's a big issue. Well, they can try the best to consolidate, Western Hemisphere, but that really is an old concept. And nowadays, we're in a globalized world. So this image, this kind of action would certainly be negative, and that's all about it.
The message from the Trump administration seems to be that countries don't get too close to China. Do you think Trump's actions in Venezuela will actually push countries in LATAM, in the global south, closer to China, or push it farther away?
They will definitely put the countries closer to China. Yeah, what the people seem to agree is that now the world has entered into a post-American order, multi-polarization period. So if the United States, is behaving like this, then people's first reaction is a kind of a disappointment. Yeah, and then of course people would look for another force that can actually become kind of a stabilizer or anchor in the world. I think China really falls into this vacuum. Yeah, because if people have no trust of the United States, then they have to look around to look for the anchor. And I believe more and more countries would just support China to be the anchor. Look at the international polls. I believe even in Southeast Asia, the poll is clear that more countries are actually in favor of China. Well, that is obvious because of Gaza, right? And see what the U.S. is doing now. Well, you don't need to have any doubts about international opinion poll, for example, from now on or until next year.
Zhou, as you say that, actually, it's quite timely, because we've also been covering the visit of the South Korean president. He arrived in Beijing yesterday. In fact, in the last few minutes, separately, CCTV is reporting that President Xi Jinping is meets the Irish Prime Minister. Do you think in any way, it's the best course of action, what I'm trying to ask, is to do nothing? How does this affect, if any, China's foreign policy priorities this year?
Well, you see, this sudden attack, it should have nothing to do with China. But what I said is my general conclusion. Yeah. So I think things are happening, although in a slow and steady way. Yeah. So people would realize the international order has changed. So they would look for something else. And right now, it's very important for China to actually demonstrate that it is great power with greater responsibilities. Because China nowadays is very big indeed. China cannot hide behind a tree because you are even taller than the tree. So I think now is a good chance for people to come to Beijing to listen to what China says. And I believe China will say the right things.
Yeah, Zhou, I think what you're trying. This is a good opportunity for China to portray itself as a sort of rules-based order, right? Does that mean that China, in some ways, will try to uphold that sort of image versus maybe putting or making more bolder steps towards South China Sea or even Taiwan?
Well, thank you for the good question, because you mentioned the international order. You see, the accusation on China is that China is not obeying the international order. That is wrong, because for me, it's as simple as that. It's very difficult for me to think of what kind of international treaties or convention China has not joined. Yeah, it's very difficult for me to think of anything like that. But on the other hand, the United States is clearly violating the international order. So I think when China talks about international order, it is talking about all the rules that we have made, and all the rules that we should follow. China does not have any specific ideas about how it should, follow this order. The orders are just orders. So I think China's responsibility now, during this time of turbulence, is first of all to behave like an anchor. The second thing China should do is to prove that it is indeed a peacemaker. Because if the world is becoming more volatile, definitely there are more opportunities for China to portray itself as a peacemaker, and China is doing that. So sometimes Chinese approaches are just like offering people Chinese medicine. Some people have some doubts whether these Chinese medicine would really work or not. But I believe there is no doubt about China's sincerity, because China is involved in the mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and China has tried successfully to mediate among the different factions of the Palestinians, and China, of course, is also trying to mediate in the war in Ukraine, which is more difficult. But I believe China really has a role, perhaps after ceasefire or armistice in the war in Ukraine, because then people would ask, okay, who's going to guarantee the ceasefire or armistice? And then China probably can do two things. One is that if peacekeeping is needed, China can take the lead, because Russia would not trust any countries coming from NATO countries. Another is probably to provide any security guarantee if that is needed. So there are simply too many things waiting for China to do.
This coming out, I have to say, against a backdrop of one of a very big military drills that we saw in Taiwan from China just a few days ago, Zhou. So I want to ask you, this whole takeover by the U.S. on Venezuela, does that in any way change Beijing's calculus when it comes to Taiwan?
Well, certainly militarily speaking, American strike on Venezuela is a very good example of military success, right? But the Taiwan situation is different. And I believe, politically speaking, as is already mentioned by a spokesman from Ministry of Defense, each provocation coming from Taiwan will invite greater pressure on the Taiwanese authorities until we reach reunification. So the space actually is kind of becoming smaller, so long as they continue to provoke China. So militarily speaking, I believe since the PLA is getting stronger, you are seeing the better coordination of all services, Yeah, and I believe in the future, this kind of things will just continue. People talk about the status quo in Taiwan Strait. I would argue there is no status quo that is static. Yeah, with each provocation and with each response from the PLA, the status quo would be changed irreversibly, yeah, toward the favor of the Chinese mainland.
Yeah, Zhou, you know, the fact, I want to use your analogy, it's a good one. The fact that China can't hide behind a tree because it's taller than a tree. A lot of these things that are happening across the world, and I think you also mentioned that what's happened in Venezuela over the weekend almost, well, directly does not have anything to do with China. Indirectly even, you could argue that too. A lot of these things are viewed because of this multi-power world now, because you do have these two superpowers, and commentators are viewing these things against that prism, rightly or wrongly. This is the most important relationship in the world between the U.S. and China. Do you think it's all systems go still as far as the progress between what we have seen last year, this trade detente? Do you think we'll still see those meetings between the two presidents this year in the U.S. and also in China? Is there anything specific you think we should know about what 2026 will hold for that relationship?
Well, you see, David, you're asking a very big question. First of all, I do not believe that we're going to have a Cold War, in the future, because during the real Cold War that happened, in last century, every day people were preparing for a hot war. So people only signed with relief after the dissolution of the Soviet Union to say, okay, what happened was but a Cold War. So that means when we look into the future, we don't know what lies ahead, whether it's really a Cold War or it could be a hot war. But generally speaking, with China getting stronger, with China having no intention of exporting its ideologies, so I believe this kind of a competition between China and the U.S. should be more manageable than that between the two superpowers during the Cold War. So I'm more optimistic, and I believe it would be a relationship of competition, as the United States said. Why? Because even if China insists this has to be one of cooperation, it's impossible, because it's the stronger one who can define this relationship, and the United States is still stronger than China. So it is one of competition, but from time to time, I believe there would be detente, because this whole relationship would not be so, volatile as compared to that between the two superpowers during the Cold War. I think it is manageable, but it certainly means that we have more work to do. Donald Trump is good in that he is not ideological, right? He's transactional. And China didn't find out until Trump's tariff war that we also have our lethal weapons. So this kind of relationship could be balanced.
Zhou, thank you so much for your time. CISS Tsinghua University Senior Fellow and former China People's Liberation Army Senior Colonel. Our coverage of Venezuela continues on today's edition of Inside Has. We'll be speaking with guests from Chatham House, Southwestern Law School, and SVB Energy. Plus, look at the view from Beijing with the Center for China and Globalization. Victor Gao from there joins us there. This is Bloomberg.
Now, President Trump has dismissed the idea of working with Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado on the nation's political transition. Now, instead, the U.S. plans to work with Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, the second-in-command of captured President Maduro. Now, Machado spoke exclusively with Bloomberg last October, just weeks after being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She discussed her support for U.S. intervention in a peaceful transition of power.
These deaths are the responsibility of Nicolás Maduro. He knows, and the rest of the drug cartels that is in power in Venezuela, that they should stop these activities in order to prevent more deaths, not only of the Venezuelan people, but also from people all around the country. And look, this is very important. We don't want war. It was Maduro who started this war. It was a war against the Venezuelan people, put in place state terrorism, as the UN and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have declared this is state terrorism towards our people, and this is narco-terrorism towards the international community and the U.S. in particular.
But I still don't understand how you see the deaths of those individuals, and many of them believed to be Venezuelan, who were on those boats when they were struck by the U.S., and mostly in the Caribbean and a few in the Pacific. You are someone who stands for people's rights, for the rights of Venezuelans, for their democratic rights, for their human rights. What about the rights to due process of the people who were on those boats?
I certainly defend the rights of everyone, not only Venezuelans. That's why my voice has been, loud all along this process. But you need to understand, all the international community need to understand, that this is a very cruel war. It was Maduro who turned this into an international conflict. Look, when you face
are those people expendable on the boats?
It was Maduro who insisted on maintaining operations that have consequences. It is Maduro that started a war against other countries, knowing that that would have consequences. I am talking about this process is about saving lives, millions of lives. That's what we need to do. I mean, we have been for years explaining the degree of crimes against humanity that take place in Venezuela and that need to be stopped.
And you can listen to that full conversation between Michelle Hussein and the Venezuelan opposition leader by searching The Michelle Hussein Show wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, you can rewatch that interview via our interactive TV function, TV Go, as well. You can also become part of the conversation by sending us instant messages. Check it out at TV Go.
Right, precious metals, even more precious, as you can see here. So the bid continues. The fact that we are in a new year doesn't change that. You might perhaps have another reason why we're seeing gold and precious metals catch a bid. The equity complex is reacting to that. Quite shows a separate story to gold, but it's the same story really. But in this specific case, of course, the AI model is gaining popularity overseas. It is one of the, if not the best performing large cap here in Hong Kong. We're 12%. So that's a story we'll continue to track. But suffice to say, apart from that, there is the Venezuela story that we'll continue to obviously cover. But apart from that, markets are really leaning more in favor of the tech and AI play, with the EM complex now at a record Kospi 3%, and US futures don't seem to be bothered at all.
Yeah, so we'll see how Wall Street wakes up here. Of course, the first kind of full trading week that we've seen here for 2026, still looking pretty good. Stay with us.